Hey, geography students. Today we are talking about migration, and specifically we're going to take a look at some patterns as to why people migrate around the world. So what are the factors, what are the patterns we can pick out as to why people migrate, some of those reasons why. So let's get started. All right, here are some trends that we see in the not too distant past. All right, the early 21st century. That means since 2000 basically, and we can see countries that they're moving to with these arrows here. That shows people from the Caribbean and some Asian countries moving to the United States and Canada. We see some areas of lesser development moving to areas of more development, like Europe here. And so we can see these general trends and a lot of that shaping the patterns of where people migrate to. All right, so today we're going to first start off with two different types of migration. Number one being forced, the other being voluntary migration. And just like the name sounds, forced migration is when people do not have a choice. There is some contributing factor that is making them leave. They do not have a choice in the matter. Whether that be war, whether it be some type of political leader forcing people to leave. If it's environmental that destroys their homes, it means they don't have a choice but to relocate. On the flip side, you have voluntary migration where people are making that choice to move. They want to see opportunity in a new place that might better their family or their own lives, and so they move in order to make their lives better. And so they make that choice to move. So those are the two types we're going to start talking about today. Let's start with some examples of forced migration. Number one being the Trail of Tears. You may have heard of this one. This is when in the United States during the 1800s, Cherokee people that were living in the southeast, mostly Georgia area, were forced to leave their homeland in Georgia and all other areas of the southeast where they lived and move west, where it was less inhabited at the time, and they were made to leave their where they had been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it was a very hard journey that they were forced to endure. They were forced to oftentimes walk miles at a time. Women, children, sick, elderly, if they were not up to it, they were oftentimes left behind or even killed if they weren't able to keep up. And so this was a tough time, but it shows an example of a forced migration where a government organization like the United States government forced a group of people to leave because of the perceived value of the land there, and so they were forced to move out further west. Another example of a forced migration would be the Atlantic slave trade. This is where obviously people from Africa, specifically West Africa, were forced to leave their homeland. They were sold by African kings to Europeans who took them to the New World. Here are some of the places they went. A little surprising here, not very many. About 4 to 5% of all the slaves from West Africa only went to North America. So the modern day United States and their descendants, only about 4 to 5% of all the slaves that left Africa during the slave trade. Most of them, as you can see here, went to the Caribbean or Brazil, where the sugar industry required a lot of workers and was very lucrative. And so that's one of the misconceptions I think a lot of people have on that, is that only about 4 to 5% actually went to North America. It was not strictly an American thing. But this is an example of a forced migration where the people were not able to have a choice in the matter. They were forced to leave their homeland in chains and forced to be slaves and work for no pay, and so were their descendants for centuries. The third example of forced migration we're going to talk about today is the Jewish diaspora. And if you have this group in your migration activity, you probably already know a little bit about this. Basically, their modern day country of Israel was where their ancient home was as well. But there were some problems along the way. In about just after the time of Christ, the 1st century CE, they were kicked out by the Romans and forced to leave their homeland because of a rebellion there. And so many of them, the Jews, fled to Africa, fled to the other parts of the Middle East. Many of them went to Europe. and they had to leave their homeland, and they would not be able to return for close to 2,000 years. And during that time they were gone, they were persecuted by many groups around the world. Not many people like the Jews having living in their homelands, and didn't consider them part of their country. And so they were ostracized. They were oftentimes persecuted, and this really came to a head in during World War II with the Holocaust. And it wasn't until after the Holocaust that they were given the modern day country of Israel, their homeland, back. But the problem was they had some other groups there. We're going to talk more about this later on. But there were some Palestinian Muslims that lived there now who also claim this as their holy land. And so there's a lot of problems that still exist today with that disputed territory. But that was another example of the Romans forcing the Jews to leave their homeland and then not being able to have it back for close to 2,000 years. All right, so moving on. What are some factors that develop migration? Why do people move? Well, we take a look at push and pull factors. Reasons why people want to leave is a push factor, and reasons why people want to go to the new country is a pull factor. It's pulling you in. That can be either economic, that's being the main number one reason why people move, especially voluntary migration wise. It could be political or cultural, some leaders, the government, whatever the case may be, or an environmental factor like a natural disaster, or good things like there is fertile farmland in the new place that you're moving to. It's also affected by distance. You're relatively more likely to move close by internally. You're less likely to cross an international border. And if you do cross an international border, you're more likely to move close by as well than far distances. As in, you're more likely, if you live in the United States, to migrate to Canada than you are to say Saudi Arabia. It's much closer by, and that's the typical pattern that we see as well. You're also more likely to move if you are a male. Men are more likely to move than females, and also if you have children, you are less likely to move than if you are single. You don't have things tying you down like a wife or children, and so you don't have to run things by them or things like that. So those are some patterns that we see. Some other types of patterns that we notice in migration is that a lot of times it is the educated elite that are leaving these lesser developed countries looking for work in the more developed countries. And that makes sense because in more developed countries, they can pay them more. You can have a better life there than if you were a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman in one of these lesser developed countries, say sub-Saharan Africa or somewhere in the Middle East, and you can move somewhere that you could pay you more. Obviously, that's a pretty easy decision. But that creates a problem for these lesser developed countries, that the people that would be running their economy and helping make their country a better place are oftentimes leaving for a better life elsewhere. And so what do they do about that? They try to offer incentives, but really, how can they compete with the U.S. and Japan and some of these other places that really want these great skilled and educated workers? The other pattern we notice is chain migration. People oftentimes like to move with family members or people that share their culture. So oftentimes what you see is like family members or maybe somebody from your country or neighborhood moves to a new place, and oftentimes people follow them. And so we see things like one family member moving from Cuba to the United States, and they are able to get a message back and tell them where they are, and then all of a sudden their family members move, a lot of people around them move, and you see a large growth of people from Cuba in the United States, and they create a little pocket for themselves in Miami, and they create Little Cuba. And so that makes it very easy for them to move. When you share something in common, you can speak the native language with somebody that you're familiar with, because that's really tough when you move to a new place, is not being able to understand the culture, the language, the way things work. So having somebody that is there with you going through that same experience is very helpful. And that's why we see that pattern of people moving together in these types of ways. There's many other examples of this. You see Chinatowns in New York City and other big cities and things like that. Other things that we see, push and pull factors. Your push factor is going to be the reason why you leave. These are bad things that cause people to want to leave that location. And your pull factor is the reason why you're moving to that new location. What's the good things that are happening there? The number one way is economic. Other being political, government organizations causing you to do so, or even environmental, causing you to want to leave. Here are some examples.